Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Chapter 6, Jutland, The Encounter. Courage and Conduct, Rogue and Toulouse. An old naval ballad. Up to this moment we have been moving through events which, although terrific, were nevertheless within the region of previous experience. The battlecruisers had fought each other before, and their admirals knew the character of the conflict, the power of the weapons, and what the ordeal was like. Moreover, as has been said, on neither side did the battlecruiser force amount to a vital stake. But the battle fleets themselves are now approaching each other at a closing speed of over 35 miles an hour, and with every minute we enter the kingdom at once of the decisive and of the unknown. The supreme moment on which all the thought and efforts of the British and German admiralties had been for many years concentrated was now at hand. On both sides, nearly the whole naval effort of the nation had been devoted to the battle fleets. In the British Navy, at any rate, the picture of the great sea battle had dominated every other thought, and its needs had received precedence over every other requirement. Everything had been lavished upon the drawing out of a line of batteries of such a preponderance and in such an order that the German battle fleet would be blasted and shattered for certain in a very short space of time. Numbers, gunpowder, quality, training, all had been provided for the Commander-in-Chief to the utmost extent possible to British manhood and science. Unless some entirely unforeseen factor intervened or some incalculable accident occurred, there was no reason to doubt that 30 minutes firing within 10,000 yards between two parallel lines of battle would achieve a complete victory. Therefore, for years, Jellicoe's mind had been focused upon the simplest form of naval battle, the single line and the parallel course. A long-range artillery conflict, and defensive action against torpedo attack. Everything beyond this opening phase was speculative and complicated. If the opening phase were satisfactory, everything else would probably follow from it. The Admiralty could not look beyond providing their Commander-in-Chief with an ample superiority in ships of every kind. The method and moment of joining battle and its tactical conduct could be ruled by him alone. It is now argued that it would have been better if, instead of riveting all attention and endeavor upon a long-range artillery duel by the two fleets in line on roughly parallel courses, the much more flexible system of engaging by divisions, of using the fastest battleships apart from the slower, and of dealing with each situation according to the needs of the moment, had been employed. It may well be so, and had there been several battles or even encounters between the British and German fleets in the war, there is no doubt that a far higher system of battle tactics would have developed. But nothing like this particular event had ever happened before, and nothing like it was ever to happen again. The Nelson touch arose from years of fighting between the strongest ships of the time. Nelson's genius enabled him to measure truly the consequences of any decision. But that genius worked upon precise practical data. He had seen the same sort of thing happen on a less great scale many times over before the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson did not have to worry about underwater damage. He felt he knew what would happen in a fleet action. Jellicoe did not know. Nobody knew. All he knew was that a complete victory would not improve decisively an already favorable naval situation, and that a total defeat would lose the war. He was prepared to accept battle on his own terms. He was not prepared to force one at a serious hazard. The battle was to be fought as he wished it or left unfought. But while we may justify on broad grounds of national policy the general attitude of the commander-in-chief towards the conditions upon which alone a decisive battle should be fought, neither admiration nor agreement can adhere to the system of command and training which he had developed in the fleet. Everything was centralized in the flagship, and all initiative except in avoiding torpedo attack was denied to the leaders of squadrons and divisions. A ceaseless stream of signals from the flagship was therefore required to regulate the movement of the fleet and the distribution of the fire. These signals prescribed the course and speed of every ship as well as every maneuvering turn. In exercises, such a centralization may have produced a better drill. But in the smoke, confusion, and uncertainty of battle, the process was far too elaborate. The fleet was too large to fight as a single organization or to be minutely directed by the finger of a single man. The Germans, following the army system of command, had foreseen before the war that the intelligent cooperation of subordinates, who know thoroughly the general views and spirit of their chief, must be substituted in a fleet action for a rigid and centralized control. At this moment the line in which they were approaching was in fact 3 self-contained, independently maneuvering squadrons following one another. But Jellicoe's system denied initiative, not only to his battle squadrons, but even to the flotillas. Throughout the battle he endeavored personally to direct the whole fleet. He could, as his own account describes, footnote, in the Grand Fleet, end of footnote, only see or know a small part of what was taking place. And as no human mind can receive more than a limited number of impressions in any given period of time, his control disappeared as a guiding power and only remained as a check on the enterprise of others. Let us now take the position of Admiral Scheer. He had no intention of fighting a battle against the whole British fleet. He was under no illusions about the relative strength of the rival batteries. Nothing could be more clownish than to draw up his fleet on parallel courses with an opponent firing twice his weight of metal and manned by a personnel whose science, seamanship, and fortitude commanded his sincere respect. He had not come out with any idea of fighting a pitched battle. He had never intended to fight at a hopeless disadvantage. If he met weaker forces or equal forces, or any forces which gave a fair or sporting chance of victory, he would fight with all the martial skill and courage inseparable from the German name. But from the moment he knew that he was in the presence of the united Grand Fleet and saw the whole horizon bristling with its might, his only aim was to free himself as quickly as possible without dishonor from a fatal trap. In this he was entirely successful. He had sedulously practiced the turnabout movement by which, under cover of torpedo attacks and smoke screens, every ship in the line could circle about individually and steam in the opposite direction without fail, even if the line was itself a curve or marred by the kinks and disorder of heavy action. To this maneuver and to its thorough comprehension by his captains, the German fleet was twice to owe its triumphant escape. Having regard to the moods and intentions of the two commanders, to their respective strategic problems, to their geographical position, to their relative speeds, and to the 3 hours daylight that alone remained when they met, it will be seen that the chances of a general fleet action being fought out on May 31 were remote. The reader must now take his mental station on the bridge of the Iron Duke, which all this time has been steaming forward, leading the center of the British battle fleet. Sir John Jellicoe has read every signal made by Admiral Beatty's light cruisers and battle cruisers. He has therefore been able to follow on the chart the course of events from the first report of the suspicious vessels by the Galatea to the momentous announcement of Commodore Goodenough that the High Sea Fleet was in sight. The forces at his disposal are moving in a vast crescent. Its southern horn consists of Beatty's detached command, a fleet in itself. On the north, or less exposed flank, is Admiral Hood, with a force similar to, but smaller than Beatty's, and consisting of the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, with 2 light cruisers and destroyers. The immediate front of the battle fleet is screened by 8 pre-dreadnought armored cruisers, followed by 4 of the latest light cruisers, the Carolines. The Commander-in-Chief knows that all his powerful advanced scouting forces of the southern flank are engaged and that a heavy battlecruiser action has been in progress for nearly 2 hours. From the first moment of the alarm he has been working his fleet up to its highest combined speed, and the whole of his 24 battleships are now steaming at 20 knots. Footnote: these, with the 4 Queen Elizabeths, made up his 28. End of footnote. As soon as he heard that the German battlecruisers were at sea, he had ordered Admiral Hood with the Invincibles and other vessels to reinforce Beatty. He finds time to telegraph to the Admiralty the solemn message, "Fleet action imminent." And far away around the intended coasts of Britain, arsenals, dockyards, hospitals spring into a long-prepared intense activity. The task is now the deployment of the fleet, and here, while the armadas are closing, we must step aside for a few moments from the narrative to enable the lay reader to appreciate some of the technical issues involved. The evolutions of cavalry in the days of shock tactics and those of a modern fleet resemble each other. Both approach in column and fight in line, and cavalry in fleet drill consists primarily in swift and well-executed changes from one formation to the other. The Grand Fleet was now advancing in a mass of 6 columns of 4 ships, each column a mile apart. The fleet flagship, the Iron Duke, led the 4th column from the right. Although the breadth of this array was over 10,000 yards, it was completely under the control of the Commander-in-Chief. His ideal at the moment of contact would be to meet the enemy's fleet in front of him, and he could for this purpose use his power of changing direction within certain limits, exactly as a skillful rider sets his horse squarely at a fence. But though the mass formation is so handy for approach or maneuver, it is, alike to a cavalry division or a great fleet, fatal to be caught in such order by an enemy who has already deployed into line. Before the British battle fleet could fight, it must deploy into line. The nearer the Commander-in-Chief could bring his fleet to the enemy in mass, the more certain he would be of being able to lead it squarely in the right direction. But the longer he waited, and the nearer he got before deploying, the greater his risk of being caught at a terrible disadvantage. It is a task like the landing of an aeroplane, of choosing the right moment between 2 opposite sets of dangers. If the Commander-in-Chief has been skillful or lucky in guiding his mass of battleships in the true direction of the enemy's fleet and finds them exactly ahead of him, his deployment will be swift and easy. He only has to turn the leading ships of his columns to the right or to the left, as the case may be, and the whole fleet, in 4 minutes, will draw up in one long line of battle, firing at its fullest strength. If, however, owing to facts beyond human control or judgment, he has not been able to point his mass in exactly the right direction, or if he is still uncertain as to the true position of the enemy, he has an alternative method of deployment. He can make either of his flank columns steam onwards and the others follow in succession until the long single file, which constitutes the line of battle, is fully formed. This second method has the advantage of being much more likely to fit an unexpected situation. The moment the enemy appears out of the horizon, the leading ship of either flank division can be ordered to take up any course which is in good relation to the hostile line, and all the other ships will follow it in succession. But whereas to deploy into line by the first method would take the British Grand Fleet of that day only 4 minutes, the deployment in the wake of one of the flank columns, or as it is called, deployment on the wing, requires 22 minutes before its full fire can be developed. Meanwhile, the whole of the enemy's fleet might be in action with only such a portion of hours as had drawn out into line of battle. To deploy correctly, accurate and instantaneous information of the position of the hostile fleet is all important. For this reason, the commander-in-chief is protected by cruisers and light cruisers under his direct control, who strive to watch the enemy's fleet continuously and tell him every few minutes where it is going and how it is formed. In the quarter of an hour which precedes the moment of deployment, these scouts, or several of them, ought to be both in sight of the enemy and of their own flagship. Out of intense complexities, intense simplicities emerge. Nothing ought to be trusted at such a crisis except direct visual signaling by searchlight flashes. This is almost like men speaking to each other. To trust in so cardinal a matter to the wireless reports of cruisers which are out of sight is to run a needless risk. Such reports are highly important and may sometimes disclose the exact situation. But if ever certainty is required, it is at the moment of fleet deployment. And certainty cannot be obtained from cruisers which are beyond the commander-in-chief's sight or not linked visually to vessels which he can see. Both the fleets and all the cruisers are moving fast and momentarily altering their whole relation to one another. The cruisers which are out of sight are very likely in heavy action, clinging on to the hostile fleet, zigzagging and turning suddenly to avoid gunfire or torpedo. They are sure to be out of their reckoning. Their reports have to be written, ciphered, dispatched, received, decoded before they reach the commander-in-chief. 10 minutes easily elapse in this process, and there are not 10 minutes to spare. Moreover, the reports from different scouting ships may not agree. 3 or 4 different versions may simultaneously reach the commander-in-chief, and not one of them will be absolutely accurate. Therefore, the fateful act of deployment should invariably be founded upon the visual signal of a scout who is actually in sight of the enemy's fleet. The only sure method of knowing exactly where the hostile fleet is at the moment of deployment is the primitive plan of having light cruisers of your own which you can see and which can themselves see the enemy and each other. Such a network of lines of sight alone ensures exact knowledge of a vital matter. The duty of clinging to the German High Sea Fleet and continually reporting its whereabouts by wireless, which could be read simultaneously by Beatty and by Jellicoe, belonged in the first instance to the light cruisers of Beatty's scouting force. And admirably did Commodore Goodenough and his squadron discharge it. There is no ground for criticizing the Lion for not transmitting signals from the light cruisers while in heavy action herself. The Iron Duke read simultaneously everything that passed by wireless. But signals from light cruisers, 60, 50, 40, or even 30 miles away proved to be conflicting and erroneous. We now know that Goodenough was 4 miles out of his reckoning, and the Iron Duke was more than 6. Reports from any of Beatty's vessels, all of which were out of sight and beyond the horizon, were an invaluable means by which Jellicoe could learn the general course of events and approach of the enemy. But they were not, and ought never to have been relied on, as a substitute for the reports of scouting cruisers of his own. Nor was the Commander-in-Chief unprovided with the necessary vessels. Apart from the 14 light cruisers detached with Beatty's advance force, Jellicoe had reserved for his own special use 4 of the very latest Caroline class of light cruiser. He had besides the 8 armored cruisers of the pre-dreadnought era, Defense, Warrior, etc. At the first alarm he had ordered these old vessels to increase to full speed and cover his front. But as they could not steam more than 20 knots, and he was himself making 18 and rising to 20, they did not appreciably draw ahead of him in these important 2 hours. The Carolines, however, were designed for 29 knots. Knowing that Beatty's force was committed to battle beyond the horizon, the Commander-in-Chief would have been prudent to use his 4 Carolines for the sole purpose of securing him early and exact information on which to base his deployment. His own battle orders declared that with less than is miles visibility references to the enemy's latitude and longitude were quite useless, and emphasized the extreme importance of maintaining visual touch by means of linking cruisers. In 2 hours the Carolines, in a fan-shaped formation, could have easily gained 15 miles upon the Iron Duke in the general direction of the enemy. They would then have been in sight of the British armored cruisers, which were themselves fully visible from the Grand Fleet. The Carolines themselves at this time could see at least 7 miles. Thus the Commander-in-Chief could, had he so wished, have had more than 20 miles accurate notice by visual signal of the position and line of advance of the German fleet. This would have been an additional precaution to enable him to bring his fleet safely in mass formation to the exact position from which he could deploy on the right course of battle by the 4-minute method. All the ships in both the fleets were, in the half-hour preceding the British deployment, drawing together in a tremendous concourse. In that period the following principal events were taking place, for the most part simultaneously. Beatty's battle cruisers, with the 5th Battle Squadron behind them, were hurrying northward to make contact with and draw the enemy onto the Grand Fleet. Hipper and Rear Admiral Boedicke, with the German 1st and 2nd Scouting Groups, were also running north, covering the advance of the German High Sea Fleet. Beatty and Hipper were engaging each other on roughly parallel courses, and the 5th Battle Squadron was in heavy action with the leading German battleships as well as with Hipper's battle cruisers. Meanwhile, Admiral Hood, in the Invincible, with the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, and preceded by the light cruisers Chester and Canterbury, was advancing on the north flank of the British array. Thus, at about 5:40, both German scouting groups were plunging into the center of the British crescent. It had now become a horseshoe, of which the southern horn, Beatty, was rapidly retiring, and the northern horn, Hood, was rapidly advancing. Hipper, with the 1st Scouting Group, was in renewed action to the southwest when, at 5:36, the Chester, reconnoitering for Admiral Hood, encountered the German Scouting Group. At 5:40, 3 of the 4 light cruisers of which it consisted emerged swiftly from the haze, and the Chester was almost immediately smothered in a hail of fire. Footnote: in the official narrative, page 36, end of footnote. Nearly all her guns were broken up, and her deck became a shambles. But the centre of the British crescent was also in rapid advance, and at 5:47 the Defence, flagship of Rear Admiral Sir Robert Arbuthnot, and the Warrior, the centre ships of the line of armoured cruisers directly covering the advance of the Grand Fleet, sighted the second scouting group from the opposite direction and opened a heavy fire upon them. Boedeker's light cruisers, glad to pursue the stricken Chester, turned away from the fire of these powerful, though middle-aged vessels, only to meet a far more formidable antagonist. Admiral Hood, with his 3 battle-cruisers, swinging round towards the cannonade, came rushing out of the mist, and at 5:55 fell upon the German light cruisers with his 12-inch guns, crippling the Wiesbaden and badly damaging the Pillau and the Frankfurt in a few minutes. The apparition of capital ships to the northward fell on Admiral Boedeker like a thunderbolt. Footnote: from the official narrative, page 36, end of footnote. From far in his rear came the reverberation of Beatty's cruiser action. This new antagonist must be the head of the main British fleet. Boedeker instantly turned to escape from the closing jaws, leaving the wounded Wiesbaden to crawl out of danger as fast as she could. The explosion of Hood's guns carried, as will be seen, a similar warning to Hipper. Meanwhile, Arbuthnot, in the Defence, followed by the Warrior, was pursuing the second scouting group. He found the Wiesbaden dragging herself away. Determined to destroy her, he came rushing down on her at full speed. Footnote: in the official narrative, end of footnote. The Lion, heading the British battlecruisers again in action with Hipper, had also converged. Arbuthnot, in impetuous ardour, pressed across her bows, forcing her off her course, throwing out the fire of her squadron and blanketing their target with his funnel smoke. He was within 6,000 yards of the Wiesbaden, and had turned to starboard to bring his whole broadside to bear, when the again advancing Hipper swung his guns upon him, as did some of the German battleships now also coming into range. In a moment the Defence, struck by a succession of shells from the heaviest guns, blew up in a terrific explosion, and at 6:19 p.m. vanished with nearly 800 men in a huge pillar of smoke. The Warrior, grievously smitten, seemed about to share her fate. But meanwhile, greater events were happening. The Grand Fleet's deployment had begun at 6:15. During these events, the run to the north had come to an end. At 5:25, Beatty had resumed his action with Hipper. The light was now favourable to the British. The 15-inch guns of the Barham and the Valiant were also firing upon the German battlecruisers, who began to suffer severely. In the midst of this, at 5:42, came the sound of the Invincible's guns attacking the second scouting group to the northeastward, and thereupon, having good reason to feel himself being surrounded by superior forces as well as being mastered in the actual firefight, Hipper turned his ships swiftly about and fell back on the High Sea Fleet. As his opponent turned away to starboard, Beatty first conformed, then curled round him due east in the natural movement of the action, and also with the object of preventing Hipper, however he might turn, from discovering the British battle fleet. It was at this moment that the Lion came in sight of the Iron Duke. Her appearance was a surprise to Jellicoe. The reckoning from Beatty's wireless signals had led the Iron Duke to expect him a good deal farther to the eastward. The cumulative error of the two ships was no less than 11 miles. Fact now instantaneously superseded estimate. There was the Lion 6 miles away and nearly 4 points more to starboard of the Iron Duke than had been supposed. It was reasonable to assume that the enemy's battle fleet was also, and to an equal degree, more to the westward, and this meant that Jellicoe would not meet them ahead, or nearly ahead, but obliquely on the starboard bow. The situation was critical, urgent, and obscure. The commander-in-chief could feel the enemy's breath all round his right cheek and shoulder, and he now evidently wanted very much to point his fleet to the new direction. But this partial wheel required 15 minutes, and he had not got them. Footnote: the sailors call it, for short, altering the bearing of the guides by so and so many points. End of footnote. As soon as he saw Beatty steaming across his bows in action and at full speed, he flashed the question, "Where is the enemy's battle fleet?" at 6:01. And a minute later, in consequence of Beatty's appearance and position, and not having time to wheel, he turned the leading ships of his divisions southward to improve his line of approach to the enemy by gaining ground in that direction. This movement lost no time and was absolutely right in conception, but it brought his fleet into an echelon formation of divisions, which was not at all convenient for deployment, and the German fleet might be very near. At any minute it might emerge from the mist 6 or 7 miles away, and forthwith open fire. And at 6:06 the commander-in-chief reverted to his previous formation, which, though not pointing true, still gave him the largest options for deployment. Meanwhile Beatty, now only 2 miles ahead of the Marlborough, the right-hand corner vessel of the battleship Mars, answered, "Enemy's battlecruisers bearing southeast." Footnote: their course was omitted. End of footnote. On which the commander-in-chief repeated, "Where is the enemy's battle fleet?" To this the Lion could give no answer. Hipper had for the moment vanished, and the Lion had no enemy in sight. Anxiously peering at the menacing curtains of the horizon or poring over the contradictions and obscurities of the chart, Jellicoe held on his course in tense uncertainty for another 8 minutes. Then at last came illumination. At 6:10 the Barham had sighted Scher's battleships to the south-southeast, and as her wireless had been shot away, the Valiant passed the news. Jellicoe received it at 6:14. Almost simultaneously the Lion reported the High Sea Fleet in sight south-southwest. These two reports placed the enemy 4 points on the starboard bow, or, in military parlance, half right. The direction was correct, but the leading German battleship, König, was placed 3 miles nearer than she actually was. On this view, further delay seemed impossible. The moment of decision had come. It became, says the Admiralty narrative, urgently necessary to deploy the fleet. The meeting having taken place at this unsatisfactory angle, a swift deployment of the fleet by divisions to port or starboard was not open. It would have brought the fleet into a line out of proper relation to the enemy's potential battlefront. There remained only the 22 minutes method of deployment on the wing. Jellicoe conceived himself limited to 2 alternatives. Either he could let his right-hand column nearest the enemy go ahead and make the others follow it, or he could let his left-hand column farthest from the enemy take the lead. If he chose the former, he ran the risk of the enemy concentrating their fire on his leading ships while the rest of the fleet could not reply. If he chose the latter, he drew out his line of battle 10,000 yards farther away from the enemy. Instead of deploying into action and opening fire at once, he would deploy outside effective gun range, and his opening movement in the battle would be a retirement. Our present knowledge leads to the conclusion that he could have deployed on the starboard wing without misadventure. The 5th Battle Squadron, with its unequaled guns, armor and speed, was in fact about to take the van ahead of the Marlborough's division of older dreadnoughts. Beatty's battlecruisers were already ahead, steaming upon the exact course. Still farther ahead in front of all, Hood, in lively comprehension, was about to wheel into the line. The whole fleet would have drawn out harmoniously into full battle at decisive ranges, with all its fast heavy ships at the right end of the line for cutting the enemy from his base. The Commander-in-Chief chose the safer course. No one can say that on the facts as known to him at the moment it was a wrong decision. There are ample arguments on either side, and anyhow he was the man appointed to choose. If he had deployed on the wing towards the enemy, and if the leading British squadrons had been overwhelmed by the fire of the German battle fleet, or if a heavy torpedo attack had developed on the van of the fleet, and if our whole line had thereby been checked and disordered in its deployment, and 4 or 5 ships sunk, as might have happened in as many minutes, there would have been no lack of criticism upon the imprudence of the Admiral's decision, and criticism would have been the least of the consequences. But there was surely a third course open to Sir John Jellicoe, which had none of the disadvantages of these hard alternatives. Although it involved a complicated evolution, it was in principle a very simple course. In fact, it was the simplest and most primitive of all courses. He could have deployed on his center and taken the lead himself. There is a very old and well-known signal in the Royal Navy which would have enabled the Commander-in-Chief to lead his own division out of the mass and make the others follow after him in any sequence he might choose. It was only necessary to hoist the pennant A above a succession of numerals indicating the order in which the various divisions should follow. It involved every ship in the 2 port divisions either reducing speed or making a complete left-handed circle to avoid losing speed, while the starboard divisions were taking their places behind the Commander-in-Chief. But the fleet was not under fire, and the maneuver was practical. It meant, in short, follow me. Out of a tangle of uncertainties and out of a cruel dilemma, here was a sure, prudent, and glorious middle course. By adopting it, Sir John Jellicoe would have retained the greatest measure of control over his fleet after deployment. He would have had 3 miles and 10 minutes more to spare than if he had deployed on the wing towards the enemy. He would have avoided any retirement from the advancing foe. He would have led his fleet, and they would have followed him. It may seem strange that he should have never attempted to deal with this alternative in any of his accounts and explanations of his actions. It is perhaps easily explained. Sir John Jellicoe was working on a definite, preconceived system. In the thunder and mystery of the preliminaries of what might be the greatest sea battle of the world, he held, as long as he could, rigidly to his rules. All his dispositions for battle had contemplated a deployment either on the port or starboard column of battleships. As a consequence, the routine system of signals in the Grand Fleet battle orders did not contemplate any such deployment on the Admiral's flag. The old signal was well known. If hoisted, it would have been instantly comprehended. But it had fallen into desuetude, and it never seems to have occurred to the Commander-in-Chief at the time. Equally, it did not occur to him to take an obvious precaution against the escape of the enemy, which could not have risked the safety of his fleet. His cautious deployment on the outer wing made it the more imperative to make sure the enemy was brought to battle. To do this, he had only to tell the 4 Queen Elizabeths of the 5th Battle Squadron, instead of falling tamely in at the tail of the line and thus wasting all their unique combination of speed and power, to attack separately the disengaged side of the enemy. These ships would not have been in any danger of being overwhelmed by the number of the enemy. They were 8 or 9 knots faster than Scheer's fleet as long as it remained united. They could at any moment, if too hard pressed, break off the action. Thus assured, what could be easier than for them to swoop round upon the old Deutschland squadron and cripple or destroy 2 or 3 of these ships in a few minutes? It would have been almost obligatory for Scheer to stop and rescue them, and taken between 2 fires, he would have been irrevocably committed to battle. This was exactly the kind of situation for which the division of fast super-dreadnoughts, combining speed, guns, and armor in an equal degree, had been constructed at such huge expense and trouble as one of the main acts of my administration of the Admiralty. But neither the Commander-in-Chief nor their own Admiral could think of any better use for them than to let them steam uselessly along in rear of the fleet at 70 knots, their own speed being over 24. Therefore, at 6:15 p.m., precisely the order was given by signal and wireless to deploy on the port wing. The fateful flags fluttered in the breeze and were hauled down. The order became operative, and 5/6 of the immense line of British battleships turned away and began to increase their distance from the enemy. The first move of the battle fleet of Jutland had been made. Both Beatty and the 5th Battle Squadron had been conveniently placed for a deployment on the starboard wing. The deployment to port forced Beatty to steam at full speed across the front of the line of battle in order to take his position in the van. Hood wheeled into the line ahead of Beatty. The smoke of the battlecruisers obscured the vision of the battleships, and at 6:26 Jellicoe reduced the fleet speed to 14 knots in order to let the battlecruisers draw ahead. The signal did not get through quickly, and bunching and overlapping began to occur, particularly at the turning point. The 5th Battle Squadron, too far behind to cross the front of Jellicoe's deployment and receiving no orders to act independently, decided to take station in rear, and executed a left-handed turn under the concentrated fire both of the German battlecruisers and the leading German battleships. Once more, the 15-inch guns and 13-inch armor of the fast battleships came into heavy action against greatly superior forces, and ponderous blows were given and received. The Warspite, with her helm temporarily jammed, fell out of the squadron and made a sweeping circle out of control and under intense fire. The circle carried her around the half-wrecked Warrior, who, in the confusion, blessing her savior's involuntary chivalry, struggled into safety. At 6:25, while the deployment was proceeding, the fleet began to fire, about 1/3 of the ships finding targets either on the unfortunate Wiesbaden, which lay between the lines of flaming wreck, or on the German 3rd Squadron, the Königs, at the head of the hostile fleet. The range was fouled by smoke, and the visibility poor. But Jellicoe's maneuver had procured the most favorable light for the British, and only the flashes of their guns could be seen by the enemy. When half the fleet had turned the corner, Jellicoe seems to have thought of coming to closer quarters by altering course by subdivisions towards the enemy. The L shape in which the fleet was then formed probably made him feel that this moment was impracticable, and the signal was cancelled before it was begun. Half the British fleet was firing by the time the deployment was completed at 6:47 p.m., and the German 3rd Squadron was repeatedly hit, no British battleship being touched in return. Meanwhile, Hood, with the 3rd Battlecruiser Squadron, had been engaging Hipper's battlecruisers with good effect. But at 6:31 a salvo from the Derfflinger smote the Invincible. In the words of the official narrative, "Several big explosions took place in rapid succession. Masses of coal dust issued from the riven hull. Great tongues of flame played over the ship. The masts collapsed. The ship broke in two, and an enormous pall of black smoke ascended to the sky. As it cleared away, the bow and stern could be seen standing up out of the water as if to mark the place where the admiral lay." Footnote on pages 49 to 50. End of footnote. Of her crew of 1,026 officers and men, 6 only survived. We will now follow for a moment the German movements. Scheer found himself under fire from the British line of battle from 6:25 onwards. He mistook Hood's battlecruisers for the van of the British line. He thus thought himself about to be enveloped. Instead of executing upon the British the maneuver of crossing the T, it seemed that they were about to do this to him. He therefore at 6:35, with the utmost promptitude, turned his whole fleet about, every ship turning simultaneously, and made off to the westward, towards England, launching at the same time a flotilla to cover his retirement by a torpedo attack and smoke screens. This thoroughly practiced evolution was performed with success and even precision, in spite of the pressure and disarray of battle. The fleets fell rapidly apart. The Germans faded into a bank of mist, and Scheer found himself alone again. But now ensued one of those astounding events utterly outside the bounds of reasonable expectation, which have often been the turning points of history. No sooner did Scheer, after steaming for about 20 minutes to the westward, find himself free, than he turned each ship about right-handed and again steamed eastward. What was his purpose? After getting back to harbour, he declared that it was to seek further conflict with the British fleet. When I noticed that the British pressure had quite ceased and that the fleet remained intact in my hands, I turned back under the impression that the action could not end in this way, and that I ought to seek contact with the enemy again. Footnote in the official narrative. End of footnote. This explanation is endorsed by the German official history. Nevertheless, it seems more likely that he calculated that this movement would carry him across the British rear, and that he hoped to pass astern, punishing the rear ships and getting again on the homeward side of the battle. We know that he was under the impression that the British battlecruisers were the van of the British line of battle. From this, the conclusion inevitably presented to his mind would be that the British battle fleet was 5 miles ahead of its position. On these assumptions, his movement would have carried him very nicely across the British tail. Instead of this, he ran right into the center of the whole British fleet, which was certainly the last thing he sought. This mistake might well have been fatal to the Germans. It would have been impossible to have chosen a situation of greater peril. Jellicoe's fleet was also no doubt somewhat inconveniently arranged. He was steaming south with his divisions in echelon. In fact, he now, at 7:12 p.m., was caught by the Germans while he was in the very posture he had so disliked before his original deployment. But nevertheless, in practice, no serious difficulty arose. As the German ships, one after another, emerged from the mist, all the British battleships, whose range was clear, opened a terrific fire upon them. The German van, the formidable Königs, saw the whole horizon as far as eye could reach, alive with flashes. About 6 minutes intense firing ensued. The concussion of the shell storm burst upon the German vessels. Hipper's long-battered but redoubtable scouting group once more bore the brunt. The Seydlitz burst into flames. The Lützow reeled out of the line. This was the heaviest cannonade ever fired at sea. It did not last long. The moment Scheer realized what he had run into, he repeated, though less coolly, the maneuver he had used at 6:35. And at 7:17 he again turned the battle fleet about to the westward, launched another series of flotilla attacks, threw up more smoke screens, ordered the gasping battle cruisers to attack at all costs to cover his retreat, a death ride, and sped again to the west. Jellicoe, obedient to his long-resolved policy, turned away from the torpedo stream, first 2 points and then 2 points more. Here, at any rate, was a moment when, as a glance at the map will show, it would have been quite easy to divide the British fleet with the 5th Battle Squadron leading the starboard division, and so take the enemy between two fires. But the British commander-in-chief was absorbed in avoiding the torpedo attack by turning away. The range opened, the fleets separated, and Scheer vanished again from Jellicoe's view, this time forever. Between 6 and 7:30 the German flotillas had delivered no fewer than 7 attacks upon the British battle fleet. The true answer to these attacks was the counterattack of the British flotillas and light cruiser squadrons, of which latter 2 were available and close at hand. These should have been ordered to advance and break up the enemy's torpedo craft, as they were fully capable of doing. Instead of using this aggressive parry, Jellicoe turned his battleships away on each occasion, and contact with the enemy ceased. The German flotillas in the whole of this phase lost only a single boat, but they effectively secured the safe withdrawal of their fleet from the jaws of death. Beatty, however, still sought to renew the action. It was above all things important to drive the Germans westward away from home. The Lion was in sight of the enemy, but the British battle fleet was drawing no nearer to her, and it was not possible for the battle cruisers to engage Scheer single-handed. At 7:45 he signaled the bearing of the enemy through the Minotaur to the leading British battleship, and at 7:47 sent the much-discussed message to the commander-in-chief, "Submit that the van of the battleships follow me. We can then cut off the enemy's fleet." Almost immediately thereafter he altered course to close the enemy. Meanwhile Scheer, homeward bent, had gradually brought the high sea fleet from a westerly on to a southerly course. The fleets were once again converging. Light cruisers and destroyers on both sides began to fire. The British battlecruisers would soon be engaged. Where was the van of our battle fleet? A quarter of an hour was allowed to pass after Jellicoe received Beatty's signal before he sent the necessary order, and that in no urgent terms, to the 2nd Battle Squadron. Vice Admiral Jerem, commanding that squadron, did not increase his speed, did not draw ahead of the main fleet, and did not ask the Minotaur for the Lion's position. He merely held on his course in much uncertainty of the general situation. Thus the Lion and her consorts were alone in the last, as in the first encounter, of great ships at Jutland and in the war. The German battlecruisers, grievously wounded, were scarcely in a condition to fight, and the light was still favorable to the British. Firing began from the Tiger on different ships at ranges from 9,000 to 13,000 yards. One of the 2 remaining turrets of the Derfflinger was put out of action. The Seydlitz and Lützow could scarcely fire a shot. Suddenly, the old Deutschland battleship came to the rescue of Hipper's gallant battered vessels, and the last salvos of the big guns were exchanged with them in the twilight. After 15 minutes the Germans turned off again to the westward and disappeared in the gathering gloom. Night had now come on. and by 9 o'clock darkness had fallen on the sea. Thereupon the conditions of naval warfare underwent profound changes. The rights of the stronger fleet faded into a grain equality. The far-ranging cruisers were blinded. The friendly destroyers became a danger to the ships they guarded. The great guns lost their range. Now, if ever, the reign of the torpedo would begin. The rival navies, no more than 6 miles apart, steamed onwards through the darkness, silent and invisible, able to turn about in 5 minutes or less in any direction, no man knowing what the other would do or what might happen next. But Admiral Scheer had made up his mind, and his course, though perilous, was plain. He was a man of resolution based on reasoned judgment. He knew that a superior hostile fleet lay between him and home. To be found in that position by the light of another day meant, in all probability, total destruction. The night was short. At 2:30 dawn would be breaking. He must act without a moment's delay. His plan was simple: to go home as fast as possible by the shortest route, at all risks and at all costs. If he found the British fleet in his path, he would crash through it. Many ships would be sunk on both sides, but the bulk of the German navy would escape to harbor. Anything was better than being caught at sea by an overwhelming force with 18 hours of battle light before it. At 9:14 he issued the following order by wireless: "Our own main body is to proceed in. Maintain course south-southeast, 1/4 east. Speed 60 knots. Accordingly, the High Seas Fleet turned from its southerly course, and preceded by its flotillas and light cruiser squadrons, steamed at its fastest united speed straight for the Horn Reef. No one can doubt that he acted rightly. Sir John Jellicoe's problem was more complicated. He now had the enemy in a position which certainly was no part of any pre-arranged German plan. He rightly rejected the idea of a night action. Any battle brought on at daybreak would be free from all apprehensions of traps or elaborately prepared ambuscades. It would be a straightforward fight to a finish in blue water, and he was more than twice as strong. His obvious and supreme duty was to compel such a battle. But how? 2 minefields had been laid in the Heligoland Bight since the beginning of the war by the Germans to impede an attack by the British fleet. The Germans had been aided in this task, for reasons requiring more explanation, by the British Admiralty, and in consequence of the exertions of both sides, large parts of the Bight were closed by British and German mines. Through these the Germans had swept 3 broad channels, one to the north by the Horn Reef, one rather more in the center by Heligoland, and one to the south by the Ems River. Both sides knew a great deal about each other's minefields. They were marked on their charts as clearly as rocks or shoals, and could be avoided with almost equal certainty. But the British Admiralty knew not only the minefields, but all the 3 German channels through them. Sir John Jellicoe, therefore, had on his chart all the 3 passages open to Admiral Scheer marked out before him. There was also a 4th alternative. Scheer might avoid the Heligoland Bight altogether, and turning northward as soon as darkness fell, steer homewards through the Kattegat and into the Baltic. Which of these 4 would he choose? No one in the position of the British Commander-in-Chief could expect to achieve certainty. Whatever decision Jellicoe had taken must left a number of chances unguarded. All that could be expected of him was to act in accordance with reasonable probability and leave the rest to fate. The final question which this chapter must examine is whether he acted upon reasonable probability or not. It was possible immediately to eliminate the least likely alternatives upon the enemy. Retreat into the Baltic by the Kattegat gave Scheer no security against being brought to battle in daylight. It involved a voyage of nearly 350 miles, giving the faster British a long day to chase in the open sea. Jellicoe could have provided for this route by the simple process, which he did not however adopt, of sending a few light cruisers to watch the area, and thus ensure timely information at dawn. The Ems route, which was long and roundabout, might also have been dismissed as improbable. Thus the four alternatives could have been reduced to two, that is, the Horn Reef Channel and the Heligoland Channel, and these two were not far apart. Sir John Jellicoe would have been justified in considering both the Horn Reef and Heligoland channels as open and likely. On this dual basis, however, a good movement presented itself. By steering for a point about 10 miles to the southwestward of the Horn Reef Light, he would have been at daybreak in a favorable position to bring Scheer to battle, whether he made for the Horn Reef or Heligoland Channel. The British fleet was at least 3 knots faster than the Germans, and was nearer this point when darkness fell. But Jellicoe seems to have formed the opinion that the alternative lay between the Heligoland Channel and the Ems, and he nowhere mentions the possibility of the Horn Reef, which was prima facie the most likely. "I was loth," he says. Footnote: in the Commander-in-Chief's Dispatches, Jutland Papers, page 21. End of footnote. To forego the advantage of position, which would have resulted from an easterly or westerly course. Footnote: that is, by his taking an easterly or westerly course. End of footnote. And I therefore decided to steer to the southward, where I should be in a position to renew the engagement at daylight, and should also be favorably placed to intercept the enemy should he make for his base by steering for Heligoland or towards the Ems, and thence along the North German coast. This was hardly the most reasonable assumption, and did not gather, but on the contrary excluded, the major favorable chances. To continue on such a course until dawn broke at 2:30 a.m. would carry the British fleet 43 miles to the southwestward of Horn Reef and 25 miles to the westward of Scheer's direct course to Heligoland, thus failing to procure action in either case. Scheer was left free to retreat by the Horn Reef, Heligoland, or, if he chose, the Kattegat, and only the much less likely route by the Ems was barred. At 9:01 p.m. the British battle fleet turned by division and proceeded almost due south at a speed of 17 knots. At 9:17 p.m. it had assumed its night organization of 3 columns in close array, and at 9:27 p.m. the destroyer flotillas were told to take station 5 miles astern. This order served a double purpose. It freed the battle fleet during the darkness from the proximity of its own flotillas, and thus enabled it to treat all torpedo craft as foes and sink at sight any that appeared. It also prolonged the British line and thereby increased the chances of intercepting the enemy. No orders to attack the enemy were, however, given to the flotillas, and they therefore steamed passively along their course without instructions or information. Jellicoe's signal to his flotillas was picked up by the German listening station at Neumünster, which reported to Scheer at 10:10 p.m. Destroyers have taken up position 5 sea miles astern of enemy's main fleet. At about 10:50 p.m., the German 7th Flotilla reported that it had sighted British destroyers. Thus, the German admiral, if the Neumünster message reached him, had from this time forward a fairly clear idea of the relative positions of the two fleets. Footnote: It is now said that he did not receive it till he got back to harbor. End of footnote. Here ends the first phase of the night operations. The British fleet is steaming southward at 17 knots, and opening to the enemy every moment his 2 nearest and most likely lines of retreat. The Germans are making for the Horn Reef at 16 knots, and are about to cut across Jellicoe's tail, against which their destroyers have already brushed. There is still time to retrieve the situation. At about 10:30 p.m., the 4th German scouting group came in contact with the British 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron, which was following our battle fleet. There was a violent explosion of firing. The Southampton and the Dublin suffered heavy losses, and the old German cruiser Frauenlob was sunk by a torpedo. The gun flashes and searchlights of this encounter were noted in the log of nearly every vessel in the Grand Fleet. Firing in this quarter, though it was no proof, at least suggested that the enemy was seeking to pass astern of the British fleet on the way to the Horn Reef. But confirmation of a decisive character was at hand. Far away in Whitehall, the Admiralty have been listening to the German wireless. They have heard and deciphered Admiral Scheer's orders of 9:14 p.m. to the High Sea Fleet. At 10:41, the Iron Duke, and at about 11:30, after it had been decoded, Sir John Jellicoe received the following electrifying message. German battle fleet ordered home at 9:14 p.m. Battlecruisers in rear. Course south-southeast, 3/4 east. Speed 60 knots. Footnote: In the official narrative, page 72. End of footnote. If this message was to be trusted, it meant, and could only mean, that the Germans were returning by the Horn Reef. Taken in conjunction first with the general probabilities and secondly with the firing heard astern, the Admiralty message, unless wholly erroneous, amounted almost to certainty. Had Jellicoe decided to act upon it, he had only to turn his fleet on to a course parallel to the Germans in order to make sure of bringing them to battle at daybreak. By so doing, he would neither have risked a night action nor increased the existing dangers of torpedo attack. But could the Admiralty message be trusted? Sir John Jellicoe thought not. He no doubt remembered that earlier in the day, a few minutes before the enemy's battlecruisers were sighted, the same authoritative information had told him that the German High Sea Fleet was probably not at sea, as its flagship was speaking from harbor. When Scheer's course, as given by the Admiralty, was plotted on the Iron Duke's chart, it appeared, owing to a minor error, to bring the Germans into almost exactly the position occupied by his own flagship at that moment. This was absurd. Moreover, he had received a report from the Southampton, timed 10:15, which suggested that the enemy was still to the westward. Generally, he considered the position was not clear. He therefore rejected the Admiralty information and continued to steam southward at 70 knots. It is difficult to feel that this decision was not contrary to the main weight of the evidence. Certainly, it is that if Sir John Jellicoe had acted in accordance with the Admiralty message, he would have had, even if that message had proved erroneous, a justification for his action which could never have been impuged. He was leaving so many favorable chances behind him as he sped to the south, and guarding against so few that it is difficult to penetrate his mind. Full weight must, however, be assigned to the elements of doubt and contradiction which have been described. At 11:30 the High Sea Fleet, after some minor alterations in course, crashed into the 4th British Flotilla, and a fierce brief conflict followed. The destroyers Tipperary and Broke were disabled. The Spitfire collided with the battleship Nassau, and the Sparrowhawk collided with the injured Broke. The German cruiser Elbing was rammed and disabled by the Posen. The Rostock was torpedoed. The rest of the British flotilla made off into the night, and turning again on their course, ran a second time into the enemy, when the destroyers Fortune and Ardent were both sunk by gunfire. A little after midnight, the armored cruiser Black Prince, which had become detached from the fleet and was endeavoring to rejoin, found herself within 1,600 yards of the German super-dreadnought squadron, and was instantly blown to pieces, and her crew of 750 men perished without survivors. At 12:25, the head of the German line, which was by now on the port quarter of the British fleet, cut into the 9th, 10th and 13th British flotillas and sank the destroyer Turbulent. In these unexpected clashes, the British flotillas, following dutifully in the wake of the Grand Fleet, suffered as severely as if they had been launched in an actual attack. The last contact was 2:10, when the 12th flotilla sighted the enemy, who had now worked right round to port, and led by Captain Stirling, with an aggressive intention and definite plan of attack, destroyed the Pommern, with her entire crew of 700 men, and sank the German destroyer V4. This was the end of the fighting. Up till half an hour after midnight, there was still time for Jellicoe to reach the Horn Reef in time for a daylight battle. Even after that hour, the German rear and stragglers could have been cut off. The repeated bursts of heavy firing, the flash of great explosions, the beams of searchlights, all taking place in succession from west to east, was not readily capable of more than one interpretation. But the Grand Fleet continued steadily on its course to the south, and when it turned northward at 2:30 a.m., the Germans were forever beyond its reach. The northern course also carried the British fleet away from the retreating enemy, and it is clear that from this time onward the commander-in-chief had definitely abandoned all expectation of renewing the action. It remained only to collect all forces, to sweep the battle area on the chance of stragglers, and to return to harbour. This was accordingly done. So ended the Battle of Jutland. The Germans loudly proclaimed a victory. There was no victory for anyone. But they had good reason to be content with their young navy. It had fought skillfully and well. It had made its escape from the grip of overwhelming forces, and in so doing had inflicted heavier loss in ships and men than it had itself received. The British battle fleet was never seriously in action. Only one ship, the Colossus, was struck by an enemy shell, and out of more than 20,000 men in the battleships, only 2 were killed and 5 wounded. To this supreme instrument had been devoted the best of all that Britain could give for many years. It was vastly superior to its opponent in numbers, tonnage, speed, and above all gunpowder, and was at least its equal in discipline, individual skill, and courage. The disappointment of all ranks was deep, and immediately there arose reproaches and recriminations, continued to this day, through which this account has sought to steer a faithful and impartial passage. All hoped that another opportunity would be granted them, and eagerly sought to profit by the lessons of the battle. The chance of an annihilating victory had been perhaps offered at the moment of deployment, had been offered again an hour later when Scheer made his great miscalculation, and for the third time when a little before midnight the commander-in-chief decided to reject the evidence of the Admiralty message. 3 times is a lot. Nevertheless, one last chance of bringing the German fleet to action was offered. Within 6 weeks of Jutland, on the evening of August 18, Admiral Scheer again put to sea. His object was to bombard Sunderland, and his hope to draw the British fleet, if it intervened, into his U-boat flotillas. His main flotilla of 17 U-boats was disposed in 2 lines on the probable tracks of the British fleet, one off Blyth and one off the Yorkshire coast, while 12 boats of the Flanders flotilla were stationed off the Dutch coast. 4 Zeppelins patrolled between Peterhead and Norway, 3 off the British coast between Newcastle and Hull, and 1 in the Flanders Bight. The German 2nd Battle Squadron, composed of the slow Deutschlands, was on this occasion not allowed to accompany the fleet. Thus protected by the airships, bristling with U-boats, and unencumbered by their older vessels, the Germans steamed boldly on their course. The preliminary German movements had not passed unnoticed by the Admiralty, and during the forenoon of the 18th the Grand Fleet battle squadrons were ordered to rendezvous in the Long Forties, the battle cruisers to join further south, and the Harwich force to rendezvous to the eastward of Yarmouth. 26 British submarines, 5 in the Helgoland Bight, 8 in the Flanders Bight, 1 off the Dutch coast and 12 off Yarmouth and the Tyne, were in their turn spread to intercept the enemy. The movements of the 2 fleets during the 19th are shown in broad outline on the chart. The day's operations were heralded by submarine attacks on both sides. At 5:05 a.m., the German battleship Westfalen was hit by a torpedo from the British submarine E-23, and she turned for home at 7:22. Admiral Scheer held steadily on his course with the remainder of the fleet. About 6 a.m. the Nottingham, one of Beatty's advanced line of cruisers, was struck by 2 torpedoes from U-52, was hit again at 6:25 and sank at 7:10. At first there was some doubt whether she had been sunk by mine or torpedo, but at 6:48 a report from the Southampton was received by the flagship, the Iron Duke, making it certain that the Nottingham had been sunk by a torpedo. About the same time a signal was received from the Admiralty fixing the position of the German fleet. Sir John Jellicoe, however, appears to have remained under the impressions that the Nottingham had been destroyed by a mine. He consequently suspected a trap, and at 7 a.m. he turned the Grand Fleet about and steamed to the northward for over 2 hours, until 9:08 a.m. It is not clear, even on the assumption that the Nottingham had been sunk by a mine, why this maneuver was necessary. A comparatively slight alteration of course would have carried the Grand Fleet many miles clear of the area of the suspected minefields, and the possibility of getting between the German fleet and home presented itself. Such a situation had been foreseen in the note which, with the concurrence of the First Sea Lord, I had sent to Sir John Jellicoe at the beginning of the war, on August 8, 1914. Their lordships would wish to emphasize that it is not part of the Grand Fleet's duty to prevent such raids, but to deal with the enemy's battle fleet. They, the enemy, may expect you to come direct to prevent the raid, and therefore may lay 1 or more lines of mines across your expected course, or use their submarines for the same purpose, whereas if you approached them from an eastward or northeastward direction, you would cut the whole fleet from its base, and you would approach by a path along which the chance of meeting mines would be sensibly reduced. In our mind, therefore, you should ignore the raid or raids and work by a circuitous route so as to get between the enemy's fleet or covering force and home. U-52 had, however, struck harder than she knew. It took 2 hours after the Grand Fleet turned again towards the enemy to recover the lost ground, so that in all 4 hours were lost and the chance of cutting off the high sea fleet seriously reduced. It cannot, however, be said that this was the cause of preventing battle. An accident of a different character was to intervene. Admiral Tyrwhitt, with the Harwich force, was meanwhile cruising near the southern rendezvous. During the afternoon, Scheer received 5 airship reports, 1 of the Grand Fleet and 4 of the Harwich force. He also received 3 submarine reports about the Grand Fleet. The British forces to the northward all seemed to be steaming away from him as if some concentration were taking place in that direction. At 12:35 p.m., however, the German airship L-13 reported strong British forces about 70 miles to the southward, and that these had been seen coming north at 11:30 a.m. This was, of course, the Harwich force. Admiral Scheer jumped to the conclusion that it was the Grand Fleet and that his retreat was compromised. He thereupon turned completely about at 1:15 and, after waiting for his battlecruisers to get ahead of him, steamed for home. Meanwhile, Sir John Jellicoe, having recovered his lost distance and having received at 1:30 p.m. a signal from the Admiralty fixing the position of the German flagship at 12:33, was now proceeding at 19 knots towards the area which Scheer had just vacated. The chart on board the Iron Duke seemed to indicate that a fleet action was imminent, and every preparation was made by Sir John Jellicoe to engage the enemy. After advancing for nearly 2 hours in full readiness for action, with the battle cruisers on his starboard and the 5th Battle Squadron on his port bow, he still saw nothing of the enemy. At 3:57 all hope of meeting the Germans was abandoned, and the Grand Fleet turned again homeward, losing on the way another light cruiser, the Falmouth, by a U-boat torpedo. At about 6 o'clock the Harwich force sighted the German fleet, but the Grand Fleet was too far off to offer them any support, and at 7 p.m. Admiral Tyrwhitt turned for his base, and thus the operations of August 19 came to an end. I feel it unfitting to end this chapter without drawing some conclusions from the events it has attempted to describe. First, material. What was the cause of the swift destruction of the 3 British battlecruisers? The side armor of the Invincible was only from 6 to 7 inches thick. She was in action at under 10,000 yards range, and her magazines may well have been exploded by heavy shells which directly pierced her armor belt. But the Queen Mary was fighting at over 18,000 yards range when the fatal salvo struck her. She was in her place in the line, undamaged, steaming 25 knots and firing from all her guns, a minute or 2 before she blew up. The Indefatigable succumbed at the same extreme range as easily. There can be only 2 possible explanations. Either the magazines had been penetrated by a shell, or a shell bursting in the turret had ignited the ammunition there, and the flash and flame had roared down the 60-foot hoist into the magazines. There is no doubt that the magazines of British battlecruisers were not sufficiently protected against long-range fire. The ranges at which the sea battles of the Great War were fought were vastly greater than any contemplated before the war. Our naval constructors had not therefore taken sufficient account of the plunging character of the fire to which the decks and turret roofs would be subjected. The German battlecruiser armor was better distributed. Moreover, the British battlecruisers, as developed by Fisher and to a large extent by Jellicoe, though more heavily gunned, were less strongly armored than their German compeers. Casting a new eye on naval architecture in 1911, I had recoiled from the battlecruiser type. To spend in those days £2 million upon a vessel of the greatest power and speed, which could not face a strong battleship, seemed to me a fruitless proceeding. I therefore opposed the increase of battlecruiser class in which we already had a superiority, and succeeded in persuading the Board of Admiralty to cancel the battlecruiser projected for the programme of 1912. And to build instead of 1 battlecruiser and 4 slow battleships, the 5 fast battleships of the Queen Elizabeth design. I also excluded the annual battlecruiser from the programs of 1913 and 1914. These matters have been fully set forth in Volume 1. Nevertheless, it is more likely that the Queen Mary and Indefatigable were destroyed by flash down the turret ammunition hoists than by penetration of their decks. The roofs of the gun houses directly exposed to plunging fire were only 3 inches thick. From the working chambers of these turrets the ammunition tube led directly to the handing room outside the magazine 60 feet below. The danger of the flash of an explosion passing down this tube had from the earliest days of modern ironclads always been recognized. Competition in gunnery practices between ships in peacetime had however led to the omission of various precautions. The magazine doors at the bottom of the tube were not doubled. One of them could not therefore be kept always closed in action, nor were they even shrouded by thick curtains of felt. The shutter which closed the hoist in which the charge was lifted had in some cases been removed for the sake of greater rapidity in loading. A free and easy habit of handling cordite in large quantities had grown up. The silk coverings of the British charges did not give the same security against fire as did the German brass cartridges cases, albeit that these had other disadvantages. All down the tube, from the breech of the gun to the magazine, at least 4 double cordite charges made a complete train of explosive. The flash of a heavy shell exploding in the gun house, or of a fire starting in the cordite charges there, might in these circumstances be carried almost simultaneously into the very magazine itself. Here is the most probable cause of the destruction both of the Queen Mary and the Indefatigable, and we know how nearly the Lion shared their fate. Against this danger the Germans were forewarned and forearmed by an incident in the Dogger Bank action of January 1915. A 13.5-inch shell had penetrated the after turret of the Seydlitz, setting fire to the charges and to a small ready magazine. A vast flame enveloped the turret and spread through the passages to the next, gutting both turrets completely and killing over 200 men. This lesson led to drastic changes in the protection of the German ammunition supply and in drill, similar to those introduced into British ships after Jutland. It was always argued by the naval experts that although the later German battlecruisers, about which we were not ill-informed, carried more armor than their British opposite numbers, this advantage was more than counterbalanced by our having far heavier guns and shells. It was, however, proved by the test of battle that the British heavy armor-piercing shell was inferior to the German shell of equal size in carrying its explosion through the armor. Such a result should forever banish complacency from the technical branches of our Naval Ordnance Department, and should lead successive boards of Admiralty repeatedly to canvass and overhaul the scientific data with which they are presented, and to compare them in an open-minded mood with foreign practices. What bearing had these deficiencies upon the chances of a general fought-out fleet battle? This question is at once fundamental and capable of decisive answer. On no occasion, either at the Doggerbank or Jutland, did even the heaviest German shell succeed in penetrating British armor over 7.5 inches thick. All hits made on 9-inch armor were effectually resisted by the plate. The vitals of all British battleships engaged at Jutland were protected by 13-inch, 12-inch, 11-inch, or at the very least 9-inch armor. It follows that if the main British battle fleet had been seriously engaged at Jutland, apart from the ill luck of an occasional flash carried down an ammunition hoist, it would not have suffered severely from German shell fire. We know that the main armaments and engines of the 4 Queen Elizabeths were undamaged after coming under a heavy fire from all the strongest vessels of the German battle fleet, as well as from the German battle cruisers. Out of 5 hits of 12-inch shell on their heavy armor, none penetrated. The roof of one of the Malaya's turrets, 4.5 inches, was hit by a heavy projectile without any damage being done. It may therefore be concluded that the armored protection of the British battle fleet was ample to resist the 12-inch shell of the heaviest German guns afloat at Jutland. On the other hand, at the Doggerbank, a British 13.5-inch shell pierced and burst inside the 9-inch armor of one of the Seydlitz's turrets, and at Jutland a British 15-inch shell penetrated the 10-inch armor on the front of the Seydlitz's D turret, and a 13.5-inch shell penetrated her 9-inch armor. In these two latter cases, however, the force of the explosion was expended outside. The Lützow at Jutland showed similar results. At least one 13.5-inch shell penetrated and burst inside 8-inch or 12-inch armor, while another drove in a 10-inch turret plate, causing a fire in the turret. At least one 15-inch shell penetrated and burst inside a 10-inch or 12-inch turret plate on the Derfflinger, causing a terrific fire which completely gutted the turret. Such were the results obtained in the two fleets engaging at long range. It would be easy to add to these examples. Had the battle been fought to a conclusion at medium or shorter range, the penetration of the guns on both sides would have been increased, but the superior relation of the heavier British shell would at every stage have been maintained. It is upon this basis of ascertained fact that the numerical strength of the rival fleets must be considered. The British superiority in the line of battle of 37 dreadnought ships to 21 German similar units, and the double weight of the British broadside were factors which may justly be described as overwhelming. The margin of safety both in numbers and in gun power was so large as to reduce the important defects mentioned to a minor scale, and to make full allowance against accidents. In the sphere of tactics, it is evident that the danger of underwater damage by mine or torpedo, the danger of losing half the fleet before a shot is fired, dominated the mind of the British commander-in-chief. This danger, though less great than was supposed at the time, was nevertheless real and terrible. Coupled with a true measure of the disproportionate consequences of battle to the rival navies, it enforced a policy of extreme caution upon Sir John Jellicoe. The policy was deliberately adopted by him after prolonged thought, and inflexibly adhered to not only before and during the encounter at Jutland, but afterwards. the policy cannot be condemned on account of the unsatisfying episodes to which it led, without due and constant recognition of the fatal consequences which might have followed from the opposite course or from recklessness. Admitting this, however, to the full, it does not cover several of the crucial Jutland situations, nor that which arose in the German sortie of August 19. Tactical movements lay open on these occasions to the Grand Fleet for gripping the enemy without in any way increasing the risk of being led into an underwater trap. A more flexible system of fleet training and maneuvering would have enabled these movements to be made. The attempt to centralize in a single hand the whole conduct and action of so vast a fleet failed. The commander-in-chief, with the best will in the world, could not see or even know what was going on. No attempt was made to use the fast division of battleships, the Queen Elizabeths, to engage the enemy on the opposite side and hold him up to the battle. The British light cruiser squadrons and flotillas were not used as they ought to have been to parry and rupture hostile torpedo attacks, but these were dealt with merely by the passive turn away of the whole fleet. The sound and prudent reasoning of the commander-in-chief against being led into traps did not apply to situations where the enemy was obviously himself surprised, separated from his harbors, and dealing with utterly unforeseen and unforeseeable emergencies. Praiseworthy caution had induced a defensive habit of mind and scheme of tactics which hampered the Grand Fleet even when the special conditions enjoining the caution did not exist. The ponderous poignant responsibilities borne successfully, if not triumphantly, by Sir John Jellicoe during 2 years of faithful command constitute unanswerable claims to the lasting respect of the nation. But the Royal Navy must find in other personalities and other episodes the golden links which carried forward through the Great War the audacious and conquering traditions of the past. And it is to Beatty and the battle-cruisers, to Keyes at Zeebrugge, to Tyrwhitt and his Harwich striking force, to the destroyer and submarine flotillas out in all weathers and against all foes, to the wild adventures of the Q-ships, to the steadfast resolution of the British merchant service, that the eyes of rising generations will turn.